He's just sort of an amazing resource, and I'm so happy that he was here today and talked in the class. And I know that when you worked on your slides, there was one slide that isn't there, but I have to quote it because I took a picture of it and I wrote it down. And Eric had a slide that said, in crisis, people need water and food and shelter and medicine, yes, but they need information first. And that's from Dr. Strong from NSF and DARPA. And I thought, that's exactly why we're even in this field to start with. So please help welcome me. Welcome him.
Thank you. Thank you. Revi, I'm very pleased to be here. John, thank you for the hospitality. It has been a very, very nice day. And what I'm doing now is setting a timer so that I can do this correctly. And when it makes a rude noise, I spent a lot of years in submarines. You'll hear a submarine diving alarm. When it makes a rude noise, we're going to stop and shift to you no matter what I'm doing. No, even further. Come all the way down. And anybody is welcome to nap that chooses to, okay? I have, as I was talking with the class earlier today, I have a bit of a thing for digital art. So you're going to see quite a bit over the next short while. If you want the sources and the artists, I've not put them on the slides. I would ordinarily do that. I do that with all the photographs that I use in other ways. But the art is so beautiful. I'll happily tell you all about it later on if you like. Here's something that is not digital art. This is just to remind you, hello everyone, just to remind you that there is a very, very wide range of disasters to think about. This is one that most people don't have anywhere on their armamentarium. This is a coronal mass ejection from the sun. This one was from about 2 months ago. This had been the 5th or 6th largest in the last 30 years. We've since had one that was 2nd largest in the last 25 years or so. Those turn out to be unpredictable, but events that give us enough time to prepare a response. So that's part of the goal, is disaster resilience, and these kinds of events serve as nice models for building some of what we need to think about. What we're going to talk about today is a little more focused. I took this photograph. This was about 6 days after the tsunami. I'm standing on the beach in Banda Aceh. There are between us and those mountains about 40,000 bodies. A number of days had passed, the skies had been clear, the sun had been out, and the stench was thick enough to cut. And while that is superficially unpleasant for those of us who fly in as international medical response team members, the people who are there, wounded or unhurt, are very aware. They are smelling the decomposing bodies of their brothers, their sisters, their parents, the baker, their postman. This is the same thing that we face in a lot of places, and people lose track of the impact of the aftermath on the survivors. And I'd like you to keep that in mind. The mental health issues that we've talked about just a little bit today associated with the survivors is more severe than most people give credence to. Let's focus on these things for a bit. First, we allow you to admire the art. Then we move right along. William Gibson is famous for in 1974 having said, "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." Yes. At that time, Gibson was talking about the upcoming successes moving from there into here and eradicating this and moving into a better world. That's turning out not quite to be so. The degree of urbanization has caught us all by surprise. Right now, Latin America is about 70% urbanized, and we'll talk a little bit more about it shortly, but this is becoming far more common than the developed side, which is so resource intensive, it's not really possible to have that for everybody now. We're going to hit population as a theme over the next short while more than once. And this is a part of the reason why. Many of you in the room already know that in 2007, for the first time in the history of the planet, there are more people living in cities than in rural areas. Unfortunately, many of them are living in places like this, and the oil that is flowing through this pipeline in Islamabad is likely never to benefit these two. The anger that we are beginning to see in Nigeria, in Yemen, have already seen in Syria, and it saw a lot in Egypt, between the haves and the have-nots is getting more and more strident and is likely to go poorly because this is coming. Our part of the world is actually going to decrease in population over the immediately foreseeable future. What's happening in that increase from 7 billion last October to 9 billion in 2050 is likely to take place 95% in the cities of the developing world, most of which will be in the periphery. Those slum areas that are beginning to aggregate everywhere in the major cities of the developing world and have no power, no light, no water, no sanitation, very little transportation, and not much communication. The communication that people are able to see is a little bit difficult because it is by and large a reflection of the developed world of which they have little hope of joining. So let's see how that's likely to build. I give you this as a fairly busy slide because the information on it is kind of crucial. When people hear about annual growth rates, unless you can do some relatively sophisticated mathematics in your head, you may not get just what that means. So I've given you a handy table over here for how long at a given growth rate it takes to double your population. So if you have, for example, Karachi here, growing at almost 5% per year, already so large it can't take care of its population at 17 million, and is likely to be closer to 35 million on a relatively linear growth, and it's likely to be larger than linear, by the way, you're going to wind up with in excess of 30 million people in a place that can't handle that. Really, can't handle it. And that's going to make people angry. You'll notice that Moscow, it says 0.2%. It's probably negative because that 0.2% is people coming in from the countryside, depopulating the rest of Russia. Russia's imploding. We used to talk about the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, Indonesia, China, India, China. The R is probably going to gradually go away from that formulation. When you look at the USA, also very small. So this kind of rate is an arithmetic certainty. It may not happen like that because the collapse may come about for important reasons, probably related to public health. But it is something to think about when you talk about the cities in the developing world. And what do those slums actually look like? Well, Mexico City, one of the places where I work, looks like this. And for those people that have spent some time in Mexico, Mexico is a massive country. And to think that almost 1/3 of the population is likely to be inside the city limits of the capital, and you're talking about the entire nation well within our lifetimes, that's remarkable growth. And the things that are going wrong in these developing world cities are made much worse inside the slums themselves. Obviously, when bad things happen, you wind up susceptible to a mortality rate far in excess of what other people might have undergone in the same event because nobody is paying attention to you. As I was talking with somebody from Nairobi earlier today, when you look at a map of the city of Nairobi that is published in Nairobi, the area that is one of the largest slums in Africa, Kibera, is reflected as a gray area and a national park. That's remarkable, right? So you wind up with this person is dead. This one had 2 broken legs. The extraction process was made far more difficult by the fact that virtually all of Port-au-Prince is a slum. We have seen that there are medical risks associated with dense populations because dense populations, particularly in slum areas, are getting partial management of their medical issues for a range of complicated reasons that we'll talk about for a moment later. But if you have partial treatment because you have inadequate medical care, you breed resistant bugs and those bugs wind up going everywhere. This one is a classic example, a beautiful and anxiety-provoking example. This is the NDM1 gene. New Delhi metalloproteinase 1, which is being intercalated into plasmids that are being spread across a range of bacterial species and conveying resistance to almost all known antibiotics, except for very unusual, very expensive antibiotics that are not generally available. You can find references to these all over the place. This is merely a flood in one of the areas of Mexico City, and they undergo that fairly frequently because the tailings ponds and the sewage disposal systems and the water runoff drains don't actually get formed in non-tenured land sites, right? If the people who are living there have no right to be there, they're not given the right for infrastructure, and that becomes a problem when you get to a place like Rochina. If you haven't actually been inside a South American slum, it's a remarkable place. There's a great deal going on. We'll talk much more about the kind of things that are going on constructively, but you can see the vulnerability in heavy rainstorms. What we're looking at with El Nino and La Nina ENSO oscillations is an exacerbation of the amplitude of the rains. So it used to be a relatively gentle drought and rain cycle. It's now getting much higher and more intense in rain pulses, and that's causing hillsides like this to slide to the bottom. And because of the lack of infrastructure, you wind up with a population that is far less capable than it could be because it's sick. I work in Dhaka fairly frequently. People are trying to make a difference there. It's a country under great stress. But on any given day, as I say, 1/3 of the population has some sort of illness. Malaria, dengue, HIV, diarrheal diseases, parasites. There are so many things that simply sap energy that the capability of working effectively through the day is compromised. And yet, when you have a chance to actually work inside these places, you often find people, more often than might be presupposed, who are very hardworking, who are clean, who want to do well, who want to have their kids in school, are very attentive to their responsibilities in the day, who would like to work anywhere. I was working in the Tangail district in Bangladesh, and I walked past, we were on a jungle trail, and there was a little compound of homes here. And as I walked by, I saw these people watching us come by, and just took my camera out and took that shot over my shoulder. As I brought the camera back, just because they were kind of pretty, and saw that shot, I went back and said, "This looks like it came out well. I might want to use this publicly. May I have your permission?" We had a good translator with us. And she said, this one, smiling, said, "Only if you come in for tea." And we did. And you see them here. Her husband was working in Dubai as a day laborer and sending remittances home, and that was keeping them alive. When the construction halted in Dubai, he was stuck. And like many places, Tajikistan is an example I'll show you in a moment, when remittance workers get laid off, because they are in many cases an important asset for their family economic health, they wind up involved in petty crime. In order to get any money at all to send home, they get picked up, put in the jail system, and deported. What happens in the jail system is something I'll talk about in a moment, but these can be, in many cases, very energetic, sometimes quite happy people who are very eager to move forward. Not to put too much of a gloss on it, but it's rewarding to work with these folks. Here's another example. One of the things we work on in the developing world is education by way of mobile, information flow by way of mobiles. Mobiles, I mean, this is a very articulate crowd. You already know that we're doing disease tracking, we're doing childbirth, text for baby, and all that kind of thing is already going on. What's less well known is the kind of thing that is being facilitated by a man like this. I took this shot on the streets of Port-au-Prince about a week after the earthquake. All he has is a car battery and an inverter and some power strips. And he's charging $0.10 per hour to charge cell phones. We had no grid electricity. The radio stations were pretty much still down. The cell systems were just coming back up, couldn't handle voice for bandwidth, but were able to handle SMS messaging. There was no fuel able to come into the country because the port was severely damaged. You couldn't get ships pierside. In fact, we had oil, petrol, gasoline ships immediately off the coast and couldn't get in. So what we had was this guy, and what we had for communication was SMS. And it was out of this that we set up the Project 4636 system that took information from these cell phones all throughout the community and funneled it into a single number, which then funneled it out to the relief agencies and the response providers that were doing what they could to move into areas of need. Yes, hi. Sorry, we. Fair enough. I was leading a medical team. I was on the ground in Port-au-Prince. I was working with the international search and rescue teams, many of which had come in with very strong capabilities, some less so until they were pairing up. And what we would do was get information that was coming in on SMS messaging in Creole. And through the Project 4636 system, we would send those messages out to the diaspora that was being coordinated by Samasource and Crowdflower through Ushahidi. They were working with members of the Haitian diaspora who knew both Creole and English. They would translate the Creole. They would then go to a satellite map and say they're talking about a place right here. And then we would get coordinates for that site. That would cycle back down to us on the airfield, and we would dispatch a dispatch a search and rescue team. So that's the cycle that Project 4636 was running through, and the short code we were using was 4636. You could send anything out there. Now you recognize full well that Haiti is by and large an illiterate society in the area that still existed. If you spoke French, which is nominally the language of Haiti, that is the elite. I used to live in Haiti, and that is the elite. They were either dead or gone. Many were killed in the initial event, and the rest of them managed to get out of the country fairly quickly. So what was left was people who spoke only Creole. So most of the people who spoke Creole, the paysans, don't have much literacy. So it was pattern matching to make phone calls, and then it was a voice call, right? That's relatively easy. Anybody that's all over the world. Because many people have alphabets in their native language that have nothing to do with a cell phone, right? So you learn the pattern matching recognition. That here meant that anybody who could use a cell phone effectively became a node, a nexus of information flow. So somebody would hear about something in the neighborhood, get it to the person with the cell phone who would send it to 4636, and would get somebody out. That make sense? Cool, sure. We began working on much more than just the entrapment issues, because we actually did some very nice histograms watching the messaging that was coming through. Initially, it was wounded and trapped. Then it moved to water shortfalls, then food shortfalls, then people lost, you know, a child has been found, that sort of thing, and then into opportunities for employment. So we mapped that out as the weeks went on. And it has proved a very rich treasure trove of understanding how to go about disaster response in waves to move from response to reconstruction and development. But it's not just mobiles. The creativity is coming in every area you can imagine, including people who are striving for improved security by growing food on their roofs. They may have nothing else, but they can grow something up there. They can develop food forests that they build into the hillsides, and the roots of the trees that they're planting for food harvesting later stabilize the hillsides. And I've got a photograph from not Balboa, what's the name of the big island? Borneo, Balikpapan in Borneo, where they have planted food forests up a hillside, so they have constant harvesting of everything from ginger to pepper trees, and those have stabilized a landslide risk. So a concentric ring of utility, each thing feeding something else. And these, of course, the Limuro toilets, these are taking human waste and creating a methane biodigester to produce small amounts of methane gas for burning in a generator to produce electricity. That's working exceptionally well in India, where the Dalits, the Dalit women who have been collecting human shit for years, decades, centuries, now, and have done it as the lowest of the low. And by the way, I'm quoting here, and anybody who is Indian can correct me please on anything, are now doing exactly what they've always done, but now they're taking that human waste, putting it into a methane biodigester, producing electricity for the entire neighborhood, charging for the electricity, and moving from tar paper shacks into small apartments. And that's happened in about 400 women in India. That's an effort by the Clinton Global Initiative, working with people inside India who are in the Dalit community. And there is, from an engineering perspective, a great deal going on in figuring out how to reduce fuel use, increase the capacity for sterilization, and increase the capacity for water generation by appropriate means that can be constructed on site. And that's particularly true here in Gaviotas. That's on the Llanos of eastern Colombia, the plains of eastern Colombia. This is a hot water kettle for a hospital in Gaviotas. And this, of course, is a solar cooker. You may see another one of those in a moment. Plus a number of other things that are being created by people who are from those communities that get enough education and have enough intersection with a place like Atlas to learn the skills they need to bring back to their environment and work effectively to help their own communities. And this is another example of that. OpenStreetMap. When the earthquake hit on the 12th of January in 2010 from Port-au-Prince, the best map that we could find was from the University of Texas Library, and it had about 400 map elements on it for the capital city of, pick a number, 2 million people. Nobody really knows, but let's say 2 million people. On that day, the OpenStreetMap group, and I have deep admiration for these guys, all nights and weekends volunteers, began collecting information from the people who were on the ground, from the responders like me, who would take a GPS coordinate, take a picture, send it up. And they began building and building, and they would send out 2 versions a day of the new Port-au-Prince map. Because remember, many buildings collapsed over the roadways, so we wound up only a certain number of routes available to us. There was no heavy equipment. There was nothing to move these massive concrete blocks out of the way except pushing at it with trucks, and that turned out to be a very destructive thing to do, so we stopped doing that after a few minutes. But by the time we ended, the 400 data elements on the original map had become 23,000, and it looked like this. And there's some very cool stuff on here, right? People didn't know where the hospital ship was, and it's down here. They didn't know where the Israeli field hospital was, up there. The MSF hospital up there, the number of IDP camps, because every one of these little red and yellow blocks is a group of 10 or more internally displaced people. People that had survived and managed to get away from the environment into some place that could sustain them for a little while. So Cité Soleil, up in the corner, one of the worst slums in Haiti, is deeply embedded with the population that had in many ways come from other places, because we put a lot of help in there fairly quickly, and that caused a migration of people into the neighborhood. But this is the kind of thing that OpenStreetMap eventually completed within about 6 weeks, and it was amazingly useful. All volunteer stuff. That has been done mostly by Haitians, and now in Kibera, that slum that I mentioned earlier in Nairobi, you can go out to mapkibera.org, and you can see that people living in Kibera are building maps just like this for their slum, giving them for the first time pride of place on the planet, being changed from a gray spot, registered as a national park, to their home. This is a message that I got from a translator sitting next to me in Port-au-Prince. I was making some arrangements for a USAID thing coming in, and the guy kind of tapped me and, did this and said, "That's not going to work." And I said, "I'll call you right back. What's wrong?" I said, "Okay, I can tell you a lot of ways it wasn't, but you didn't ask me anything, right? Don't do anything for me without me. That's rude. And it will be counterproductive because you don't know what you're doing." And by the way, that's not much of a paraphrase. He was that blunt. Right, sorry, got it, yep, I'm on it, yep. So, and she's in Port-au-Prince, by the way. So, I'm going to stop there for a moment. I'm going to take you into a few things around hazards, trends, and shocks, the things that we're looking at in the world as upcoming threats. But first, I want to talk about anything you want to talk about in any of that. Anything from anyone? Yes?
I'm curious about why the population is urbanizing, like you said, the Mexico example.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if it's so dense in the city and the conditions are so poor, why are there so many people there? That's
a wonderful question. What she's asked is, why are people urbanizing? Bedrock question. Yes, we say it's happening, but why? Let me try a couple of reasons, and there will probably be more opinions in the audience. The number one reason is opportunity. If you are a woman, a young woman in a village in many corners of the world, your life will suck unless something important changes, right? There are various other ways to phrase that, but you will have obligations, you will have a cultural norm, you will have somebody to whom you are subservient in most cultures in the developing world. I don't want to get too broad in this, but you get the general idea. If you don't do something yourself to leap forward out of that conforming boredom that has no change day to day until you die exhausted, you'll die exhausted. So particularly women, particularly in China, are moving into the coastline and getting jobs that you and I would probably not care for, might not even respect, and they're living 8, 10, 12 to a room in a dormitory setting and sending money home. But it is, in their view, I'm told, remember I have no personal knowledge here, I'm told it is an order of magnitude better than anything they could have hoped for 5 years ago. And they are sending money back to their parents, and their parents for the first time are getting indoor plumbing, or a toilet, or running water, or warmth, right? So although it may not look like it's an advantageous thing to do, it's profoundly advantageous. And there's a particular statistic that came out around slums. The study was done in Kibera that says, if you come from the village into Kibera, your life will be miserable and then you will die. But in the process of going through that life, you're going to set some foundations, and your children will probably make it to a little bit better than you have, but their children have a better than even chance of making it to an apartment. When you look at 400 years, pick a number, of unchanging feudal servitude in the village, and you look at in 2 generations, you have an opportunity for a house, an apartment, and in between you have a generation that can accrue an education. That's a lot. So does that help? Yeah. And by the way, other people? What else? Yeah.
I was just going to wonder, this could be kind of
I got bombed a couple of times. I'm deaf.
Okay,
Tell me.
Sorry. That's hardcore.
It's truth too.
So this could be maybe something you address later on in the presentation, but kind of stemming off of her question of the urbanization of cities, what's being done to address overpopulation in whole? Why aren't political candidates kind of addressing zero population growth? Because it seems to be the underlying problem that kind of seems to be facing humanity as a whole. We will eventually run out of resources, run out of space. We've already passed the carrying capacity for the planet 2 years ago. And with the rates that you showed in population growth, it's just going to continue to accelerate. And so what has been implemented within, some very well traveled, within other countries, within our own country, that will address this kind of growing issue?
Okay, the question is about population, and if that seems to be the underpinning of so many issues, why isn't it being addressed more openly, and is it being addressed anywhere else? Fabulous question. So, in my view, yes, of course, it is a core component to almost every issue we face. To the class that I talked with earlier today, I had sent a pre-reading called, and it was a paper originally published by the Stockholm Resilience Institute called 9 Planetary Boundaries. It's a massive paper, right? It's like, what is it, 37 pages or something. Nature, arguably the finest science journal on the planet, boiled it down to a distillation of 8 pages and had it as a special edition in November 2010 of Nature. That points out that there are a number of things that are going very, very badly, and of those 9 planetary boundaries, which were decided on by a very good scientific effort by a very wide range of people internationally, 3 have been exceeded significantly. 2 others maybe have been exceeded, but are very difficult to measure, certainly are challenged. So you would think that that would lead to an international discussion about about population management, population control, population reduction. None of those resonate well in the Western world. The one-child population, the one-child policy in China got a lot of attention placed on China. China's top tier in their equivalent of a Politburo are in many cases engineers. They are people who can do math and watched that kind of slide and said exponential growth is so destructive for our society that we have to do something, even though it's quite drastic, even though people will chastise us for it, may actually choose not to do business with us because of that policy. We have no choice. This is just math. Other places have tried, by the way, it's exceeded. And they have, somebody may know the number, they have something like 400 million fewer people than anticipated when they were doing the numbers 25 years ago. Second part of that, some areas of the world are doing very well at population management through behavioral modification, not through coercion. Mexico is a lovely example. Mexico used to have a very high birth rate and cut it by more than half in 10 years with a couple of things that took place. One was that the church, the Roman Catholic Church, began to wane in influence, and the society became more secular and less rigid about conformity to Catholic dogma. Second was there was a deliberate social engineering effort inside the telenovelas, the dramas that are the bread and butter of many Mexican households, to have parallel tracks, parallel storylines. One family has followed Catholic teaching, does not use contraception at all, doesn't even use the rhythm method, has the largest family that the patriarch wants to have. They wind up with all kinds of issues. They can't pay proper attention. They don't get adequate education. Nobody makes a decent income. The house is too crowded. Lots of fights because of the other family chooses to take a contraception role early on. They have a controlled family growth. Everybody gets an education. Everybody gets well fed. The tensions inside the household are minimized because everybody has their own space. And they dropped their birth rate by more than half over a decade with those kinds of behavioral change and influence. Seems sensible to me, right? Well done, Mexico. And those things are happening. What turns out to be the absolute best, far and away, population control method for the planet? And all of you know this. What's the number one thing you can do to drop a birth rate precipitously? Educate women, absolutely. Educate women. For reasons that are complex, many women don't get educated in many areas of the world with very high birth rates. I find that nonsensical, of course. Most right-thinking people should, but my saying so does not seem to affect the people that are actually in a position to do something about it. I have worked quite a bit in the Middle East, and my efforts at subtle and I think reasonable social engineering have been met with silence and an unwillingness to work with me any further. Well, shit. Okay? So there are a lot of impediments that are culturally and politically driven. They are economically devastating, And I would think that they would be shameful. That doesn't seem to be the case. I am a father of very, very capable daughters. My 16-year-old is in college. My 20-year-old runs a farm in Accra, Ghana. I know full well what the other half of the species is capable of doing. And that educational effort is probably the single best button to push in international development. That's well recognized. And there are other people in the room that could probably tell me where somebody else is doing this well. But I start and finish, frankly, with educating women. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Okay. Yes,
With
ma'am.
the behavior change in Mexico, who and how did they infiltrate the society, like on what level, to make that behavior change happen and have the church be less influential?
The question is, how did they make that behavioral change in Mexico and make the church less influential? I think it was a natural progression as education came up. I don't need to offend people here in the audience, so I'm not going to go very deeply into my own feelings about religion, but it's not surprising that as people gained some education, they began to question doctrine that is probably worth questioning. They come up with independent conclusions and act accordingly. I tried to do that delicately. How'd I do? Yeah, all right. You had a question? No? Okay. I'm going to be out of time in no time, but I'm going to move through a couple. I'm sorry, yes? Okay. I'm going to move through a couple of slides, and if there's something you want to know, let me know. Pretty art, pretty art, pretty art. For those who don't know, when you talk about disaster risk reduction, you have a Venn diagram of exposure, vulnerability, and the hazard itself. You need to work on all pieces of this. The equation is very, very simple. And each one of these things are very addressable and frankly, a lot of fun. But in order to identify those risks, you need to think about the hazards that you face every day, the things that you can see coming at you, and then do what you can to think about what's likely to surprise you. Because the surprises are out there. Here's a trend that ought to have really great relevance for you. You have some significant water stresses occurring right now. This blood drop here in the middle is you. Where I work, Mexico City is in terrible trouble. Lima, it turns out that Lima, Peru is entirely dependent upon the tropical Andean glacier melt. Seasonal rainfall doesn't come anywhere near close to supplying that city of almost 7 million people, most of whom live in slums. The melt rate for those glaciers is higher than expected. The models are getting revised every 2 years, and each one is showing a little bit of acceleration. Lima is going to run out of water eventually. Nobody knows what they're going to do. I've taught at the University of Cayetano in Lima, and there are water signs all over for conservation. That's a mitigation factor, you know, but it's not going to solve the problem. There is the first capital city on the planet, national capital, that is likely to run out of water before 2020. Where is that? Capital city of a country going to run out of water and is probably going to need to be abandoned before 2020. Where?
Riyadh?
No. She said Riyadh, and that's not so. Close though. Close. Go south. Yemen. Yemen. Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, is sitting on a fossil aquifer, and it has had a very complex water delivery system that by and large has been managed by warlords. Those warlords were getting paid by oil money. The changes that have taken place as Saleh leaves and the population begins to rise, that oil money is no longer paying off the warlords. They are no longer taking care of the infrastructure associated with the city. People are already migrating out of the city, so some of the people who were responsible for caring for that infrastructure are now gone, and it's slowly dwindling. They're going from 2 hours of water a day to hours of water every other day, and that fossil aquifer is losing all of the infrastructure that is allowing water to be in the pipes. They're going to go to boreholes, and then they're going to have to abandon the city. You heard it here first. Watch what happens. And by the way, that won't happen gently. That country is already angry, and some of the wealthiest people on the planet live a few miles north in Saudi Arabia. Watch what happens. Here's another trend. As climate change takes place, and for those of you that skipped 4th grade, climate change is taking place. Peggy Hamburg, who used to be the public health director for the city of New York, and is now the director of the FDA, actually, sat on this committee, and I sit on with her on other committees, and we've talked about this. The number of changes that are taking place in the distribution of infections that are vector-borne is remarkable. Laura Garrett at the Council on Foreign Relations wrote Betrayal of Trust about the disintegration of global public health infrastructure. It is one of the first things to get hit. As I recall, and don't quote me on this one, I know I'm on camera, but don't quote me too much on this. I think it was Portland that had to let go 3 of its 4 public health staff on the city of Portland's governmental structure because of funding cuts. Well, Portland's a pretty hygienic city, and they'll probably do okay for a little while, but what does that really represent? Things are happening elsewhere as well, and what Lori writes in that very thick book is beautifully detailed, and if you want to follow her blog, you'll learn much more. But people have lost, as a result of the global economic downturn, the ability to allocate resources to global public health, and the consequences are going to be severe. And some of them are pretty subtle. Here's an example. Blue tongue. Who in here has ever even heard of blue tongue? Right. This is not a disease of humans. This is a disease of sheep. And Pliny the Elder wrote about it 2,000 years ago. It had never been seen outside of the Mediterranean basin until a decade ago. And it was now found in Norway in 2009. The vector is a midge, little no-see-um, carrying that virus. About 2007, it hit the sheep country of Wales and England and Belgium, northern France, and had an economic impact on that industry that is relatively minor in the overall scope of the economies of those countries in these days, but would have been devastating had it happened 150 years ago. John?
What does blue tongue do?
Blue tongue, right, it's a fatal disease. It causes blistering in ears and other mucosa, oral mucosa, all the way down the gut. Eventually there's bleeding, the animals bleed out and they die. So, and it's carried by a little no-see-um. So, there are a lot of examples of vector expansion. The northern pine, where I live, right, near British Columbia, the pine bark beetle should not be able to live through the winter. But the winters have been so mild, it's not killing the beetles. They go into a kind of hibernation, and then they start munching away again, and thousands of acres of British Columbia forest are dead. So, say again? Oh, you guys too? Didn't realize that. Okay. Well, my sympathies, we share our pain. So those are trends. Those are things that you can see coming. And by the way, I can stop at any point. But those are things you can see coming. All right? Those are trends. They're obvious. All it takes is a look, and somebody ought to be able to do something about that. The fact that they're not my colleague with the wonderful plastics repair is an indication of a lack of seriousness, in my view, in the political world, but you guys know that. You don't need me for that. And that wasn't a very sophisticated thought. I'm sorry about that. Shocks. Shocks are different. Since the Haiti earthquake and the Chilean earthquake, what you see here is probably a mix of the familiar and the unfamiliar. For example, the Pakistan floods displaced the equivalent of the entire state of California on the move. 20 million people had to move. Queensland floods. I won't get into the details as I talked in the class earlier today, but basically coal mines flooded here, wound up with people having to move back into slums in Mexico City. The Mexicali Earthquake. Amazing consequences. So, Mexicali, little town on the California border south of El Centro. 4 months after the Haiti earthquake, April 7th, 2010, Mexicali underwent a same magnitude earthquake as Haiti, 7.2, huge earthquake. But it was a shear quake, right? It was a horizontal motion quake. So 4 people died. About a quarter of the city was damaged in one way or another. But what really happened, and it was invisible unless you happened to be involved in that circle, was that the irrigation canals sheared. They moved laterally and broke. That is a breadbasket in northern Mexico. They grow vegetables, they grow flowers for export, and they grow wheat and corn. They lost irrigation through flooding, and so that crop was lost. It was ready for harvesting, it was April, right? That crop was lost. The irrigation canals were not repaired for more than a year. 3 crops were lost. In the meantime, there is no social support for the farmers who were displaced and unable to gain the crop money that they needed. Their loans came due. They were only partially forgiven, and a subset of the farmers have wound up as internally displaced people, right, IDPs, in camps in northern Mexico, having lost their farms, and that land is now lying fallow. Those lands were supplying markets in Mexico City, in Monterrey, in Ensenada, in Veracruz. Those markets have had to lay off people. Those people went from their little tiny apartments back out into the slums. We are that kind of interdependent as a society, even for something that didn't actually kill very many people. Only 4 people died. And yet, Russian wheat fires, you can read what that is. That was an amazing event. But what really matters is what was behind those. The heat wave. There was a heat wave in Russia in the summer of 2010. Between June 15th and August 15th, any guesses on how many people died in Russia as a result of that heat wave? As many people as the US lost in the entire Vietnam War. I find that an astounding figure because I'm deep in this community. I heard nothing about this. 50,000 people died in a heat wave in 2 months, and I missed it entirely. Okay. It's going to make me stop in 2 minutes when the submarine noise goes off. I can keep going for anybody who wishes to chat about it, but let's stop for a moment and talk. Is there any question or any discussion point on any of that?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
How come you're not on the news or in huge forums telling all this to the world?
It's not my job.
It's not your job?
It's not my job. I do other things. I do think this stuff needs to be better known than it is. I agree with you. And there are a number of different ways to do that. I've chosen to stay on the ground and I work out there, right? I don't do the public forum. I don't tweet. I was getting yelled at earlier today. I don't tweet. I don't post on Facebook. I don't do anything. I make phone calls and write emails. What's that?
But your number one solution is education.
Oh, it is. And what I'm doing right now is setting up a number of schools for women in Mexico, in rural Mexico. So I'm doing the practical stuff that I can figure out how to do. There does need to be a better conversation, particularly in the United States, but much of this stuff is very well known inside the developing world, inside other countries. We're a little behind. We seem to be not paying much attention to anything outside. I mean, when we can have a GOP primary discussion topic being the scorn associated with somebody speaking a second language. are you serious? The man is taking hit. Now, mind you, I don't like any of them, but the man is taking hits because he speaks French? Really? That's the level of discussion? Okay, fine. So if you'd like to talk about how things could get better publicized, I'm willing to chat, but it needs to go to people who don't particularly want to hear, as far as I can tell. I'm going to roll over into some things here. Everybody can leave without a moment's hesitation, and I won't be the least bit offended. Eventually somebody's going to take me out for a beer, okay? So leave whenever you need to.
I'm going to push our reservation.
No.
Yes, a little later.
Okay. I don't actually like beer. I like wine, but that's a bit more detail than you need. Isn't that pretty, though? Yeah. You've had that behind. I've had that behind me while I just, in case you didn't like what I was saying, you could look at that. Most of you, I'm not going to spend any time on this. Most of you are very familiar with complex adaptive systems as a concept, right? Their non-linearity is the thing that kicks your ass every time. You think you know what's about to happen, things trend along, and suddenly you have a collapse or you have an acceleration far out of proportion to the input. Non-linearity. So all this stuff, self-organization, chaos, evolution, yes, yes, yes. What that really means is, for me, this stuff. Slums are complex adaptive systems by their very nature. Right? All of these things are true in all of these informal settlements that have no legitimacy for their presence, and occasionally something happens that people come together long enough, and in the ways that something completely unexpected transpires. That has been particularly true in Uruguay and in Bolivia and in Ecuador. Those three countries have decided, from a grassroots initiative from displaced farmers who are by and large on the peripheries of the larger cities like Montevideo, to take a very responsible environmental step, and at least two and maybe all three are writing new constitutional amendments that give rights to the environment. It's remarkable. And it's this kind of thing. There's a coalescing of events, and something completely unexpected comes out. Now, when those things happen at the national level, you wind up with a place like Tajikistan. Most people would have trouble finding Tajikistan on a map. It is the northern border of Afghanistan. The Amur Darya River serves as the common border. You have the tea house that is the reason I came to Boulder the first time. I was actually working in Dushanbe when somebody said, by the way, did you know we took a tea house and put it in Boulder, Colorado? So I made the pilgrimage to see the tea house, and now I'm meeting tomorrow with the CEO of the Rocky Mountain Institute. Are you guys familiar with Amy Lovins and RMI? It's a pretty good group. They have one branch here. They have the original group in Snowmass. But I've been a senior fellow at RMI for about a decade, and I work very closely with Amory. And we're going down to Gaviotas. I showed you the windmill, and if you don't know Gaviotas, let me recommend it to you. There's a book by Alan Weissman that you might enjoy. But Dushanbe is in the plains, kind of the rolling plains. And from about here on, it looks like the Himalayas, right? It's the same group as the Himalayas. So this is profoundly mountainous. It was a Soviet satellite state, of course, right? It was just part of the stands. They had a very significant social support from the Soviet Union for 70 years. That included, for example, every household living in the Pamirs got 2 tons of coal dropped on their doorstep every October. That went on for 70 years. The Soviet Union collapsed. With that collapse went all of that social understanding, all of that social support. And what particularly happened was a loss of the middle tier of medical capabilities. There were plenty of clinics that are run by the state. There are central institutions in Dushanbe that are run by the state. But all of the intermediate regional facilities, the larger hospitals, the air ambulance service, all that kind of stuff was run by the Soviet Union, paid for by the Soviet Union. When they collapsed, so did all that middle tier. So what you wind up with is, between the ages of 15 and 44, the majority of males in Tajikistan go into Russia for the summer to become remittance workers in the construction, mostly the construction industry, and send money back to support their families for the winter. When oil was at $130 a barrel, that worked great because Gazprom was funding a lot of construction in Russia with day laborers from Tajikistan. The Tajiks are almost as despised as the Chechens by native Russians. So that was a problematic relationship always. And when the oil price collapsed and construction stopped, they still had only this habit of remittance working. And again, as we mentioned earlier, they got into petty crime, got picked up and stayed in the Soviet prison, said the ex-Soviet, the Russian prison system for a little while before being deported. In jail, naturally enough, they picked up HIV, IV drug abuse, and multi-drug resistant TB. Then they were deported. They arrived in that broken medical system with infections and complications of those infections that nobody really was prepared to manage. So they did what they could, and what does that wind up with? Partial treatment. That partial treatment, in turn, has gone from multi-drug resistant TB to extremely drug-resistant TB, and now we have the first 12 cases of what's known as TDR, totally drug-resistant tuberculosis. Of those 12 cases that were identified in February, 3 are already dead. They are completely resistant to all known antitubercular medications. This is not good. It's not going to stay in a cluster of 12. Multi-drug resistant TB was initially, I think, identified in 1996. It's now in 65 countries. Okay? We can anticipate that over time. All these things are going on inside that little tiny country. That country has a lot of water. The Pamirs have glaciers. The Fedchenko Glacier that you see there is 70 miles long and fresh water. That turns out to supply the Zarafshan River, which goes out that way, the Bartang River here, the Surkhab. All of those are available for water down in here. And this turns out to be a breadbasket. This is Uzbekistan. For the bread, it's the breadbasket for Russia, still. Uzbekistan is a much larger and much meaner country than Tajikistan. Tajikistan only has 7 million people. Tajikistan wanted to build a second hydroelectric plant because 99% of their electricity comes from one hydroelectric dam in the center of the country. That is, of course, a national security issue. They wanted to do better than that. India offered a southern hydroelectric dam, and China offered a northern electric dam. That, in turn, became new information for the Tajiks, who learned that in order to get the reserve behind the dam to give you 364 days a year of power, you stop downstream flow for up to 15 years. It takes a long time to fill that reservoir for reliable power. Well, that would cut off the downstream water for the breadbasket in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan, in hearing of this discussion underway and knowing the consequences, planted landmines on the Uzbek side of the border, saying, don't do this, right? Don't do this. Complicated, water agreements are turning out to be a dominant part of international negotiations, far more so than I ever would have recognized. Did you know that of the 800 or so transboundary water agreements that are currently in effect, more than 100 date from the Roman Empire? The Danube is one of those. The use of Danube water was set during one of the emperor's realms. Who knew? So, I just wanted to make sure you saw, I'm sorry?
What was brain drain?
Right, that they have gone through 3 languages in the last 75 years. When they were first, so originally, several generations ago, they spoke Dari, the equivalent of Persian. With the incorporation into the new Soviet Union, they began speaking Russian. Then, when they achieved independence in 1990, they went back to Persian as a nationalistic fervor. Now the kids all want to speak English. On any street in Dushanbe, you'll see street signs in all 3 languages. Most of the markets and the retail outlets have their signs in 3 languages. They have textbooks that have been printed over the decades in 3 different languages. So you have a very unstable population from an educational capability, and communication is quite difficult even inside the country, and mixed up with nationalistic fervor in various ways. That's so. The brain drain means just that, right? It has already been complicated, and people who can get out seem to. Again, anybody can leave at any point. I did want to show you, though, what a broken irrigation system looks like. I'm doing a lot of work this week here. You see that beautiful valley north of Ensenada? It's the Guadalupe Valley. I'll be working in there beginning Wednesday afternoon through the weekend. It is an area that is impoverished. They are under water stress, and they are hoping that with an alteration in the way they use their water, they're going to be able to expand their capabilities for food production without actually altering their water allocation at all. So we're going to try to use that. But these kinds of things are very, very difficult. And for those of you who haven't seen a refugee camp, this is currently the largest in the world. This is Dadaab. In 1990, it was built to hold a relatively modest, was it 30,000? I've forgotten. 30,000 people, Somali refugees in eastern Kenya. It now holds something in excess of 470,000. And because of issues related to national sovereignty, the Kenyan government, and land that is worthless, they were not allowed to form the UNHCR was not allowed to place the camp where they wanted it. They had to have it here. The problem with here is that there is no water. They are tapping a lens, a fossil aquifer that is not recharging. The boreholes are already going down a meter a year, so they're using the last of that water. Kenya does not want 470,000 Somalis elsewhere in Kenya. There's a little redistribution, but not much. Ethiopia doesn't want them, and they can't go back home to Somalia. It's still just as broken a state as it was when they arrived. Plus now there's a drought and a famine. This can't work. And it'll be very interesting to see what eventually transpires. It won't be long. It'll be inside a year. What eventually transpires to manage this problem, because it is fantastically expensive to truck in water. Nobody's willing to pay for that. Watch what happens, because that's going to be a harbinger of what kind of policies will be put in place as that begins to happen elsewhere. Looking at complex adaptive systems, I took this photograph about a week after the earthquake, and my question was, how in the world did he do that? Everything was broken in Port-au-Prince, and yet he shows up with clean, packaged water that's been distributed to him, and he's telling me it's 5 times the cost it was a week ago. By the way, for those that may not know, that's the normal way to buy water in much of the developing world. Those sachets are everywhere. You can find them in Indonesia, in Thailand, in India, everywhere. So nothing surprising about the sachets, but they've gone from 2 cents to 10 cents. And talking with him, and he speaks only Creole, of course, talking with him, he can't tell me much about the distribution system, and he doesn't know where the water is packaged. He doesn't know where the plastic came from, or the sealing, or how the water was purified. That's the kind of stuff we're trying to figure out beforehand with the efforts that I have underway now in a couple of places. And we'll stop here with the data that we are trying to collect before events to provide to national, regional, and local governments and the communities themselves so they can begin mitigation strategies. It's huge fun. I'll happily tell you in depth all about it if you'd like to hear. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your patience.
Well, and since we moved the dinner reservation back a half hour, anyone that wants to stay and ask questions, please do. Otherwise, thank you for coming to our speak tonight.
Yes, yeah, feel free to wander out. Yes, sir.
One of your last slides had Brazilian.
I can't hear a thing. What?
Sorry. one of your last slides had resilience up there.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could just give examples of natural disasters where humans have just fought back so bravely to give a positive image walking out, because this is all we need.
Oh, so depressing. I'm sorry. Yeah, well, what I'd recommend to talk about, well, there are a couple of things to do. Janine Benyus has done a couple of talks on TED about resilience and what it means to communities, and she's working with them around the world. Let me recommend that you listen to her talks. In my case, I'm working on the rapid propagation of distributed renewables for the purpose of women's education. That is turning out to have more repercussions than I thought, all quite positive, and we're getting a positive spiral of good. Those communities are beginning to look at distributed renewables instead of dependence upon the grid, because the grid in their communities won't appear for decades, if ever. So giving people the opportunity to collect a little solar, a little wind, a little microhydro. Microhydro, people don't recognize that little tiny generators that you immerse in streams are a beautiful, robust technology. You set it down there, you hook it up to some car batteries, and it will run for 100 years without any maintenance at all. It was actually developed in your country, right? This is Colorado stuff. You used it in mines. You used the what are they called? Penfold, not Penfold drains. The Pelton wheels, and that kind of capability is underutilized, and would supplant much of the large-scale hydropower that people would like to have. It runs water pumps to irrigate fields and so forth. There are many things that are happening good in many of these areas, including in the urban landscape. Letting people get an opportunity to take a marketplace of ideas and a marketplace of goods into something that they can control on their own and keep them away from waiting for power, lights, schools. Right? They can take their own. So there's quite a bit out there to read about, and I'd be happy to direct you if you like.
So, thinking that, and it's a big question, but wash and electricity are kind of a precursor to education.
Really? Why is that?
Not necessarily.
Not for me.
Okay. Well, and so that was kind of coming from this thought that if you develop unsustainably, then it would contribute, and without the education, it would just contribute to the population growth. And so that's
I think you're right.
the education component in the development is making it sustainable.
Interesting, you're right, interesting big question. I have some photographs of me working in Kakuma, a refugee camp in northern Kenya, where I was sitting on the ground underneath a tree, surrounded by girls and my translator, and we were talking about public health. Simple stuff, hand washing, right, that kind of thing. We needed nothing, right? We were out there all day. We had food and drink brought to us, simple stuff. And at the end of the day, they knew a great deal more than they had before, and their behavior changed as a consequence of what they'd learned. No water, no sanitation, nothing required other than a place to have the freedom to learn. It's the freedom to learn that's driving me crazy.
But it sounds like the education was based on public health.
It was.
And sanitation. But also the freedom to learn, like if you don't have proper water and sanitation and you're sick, then you don't have electricity, then you would have less capacity to have the freedom to participate in education and those kinds of activities.
You are absolutely correct. Yes, yes. To be weakened, exactly. It's a bit of a balance, no? Remember in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, 1/3 of the population is sick on any given day. That's a real impediment. Most of the people who are sick are women. They are the ones at home. They are the ones interacting with babies. They are the ones that are doing the washing. They're the ones that are most exposed to the fomites, the Kleenex equivalents that are carrying the various kinds of germs. I haven't used the word germs in a professional place in a long time, but germs. The opportunity to get into where they are and begin with behavioral change at the simplest level is enough to reduce the disease burden, and that really ought to be a decent start. That ought to be an achievable goal, a desirable goal. We'll take it from there. One of the reasons, in fact, Ravi and I were talking earlier today, that one of the reasons that I work with Nangarhar Medical University in Jalalabad in eastern Afghanistan is because they are the only medical school in Afghanistan willing to train women doctors. So, okay, good behavior should be rewarded. I'm talking with all my buddies saying, get on a plane, go teach over there, right? We'll get good translators for you. Go give whatever kind of expertise you have to those people. They are pathologically hungry. They will not sleep for a day and a half if you are present and they're at risk of losing you. They'll keep you up, they'll keep, you'll keep yourself up to impart what knowledge you can. They're that hungry. And every so often they get bombed. I was supposed to go over there last December and we took 2 mortar shells onto the grounds from the Taliban because they know full well we're training women. That caused people to go away for a little while and now people have come back. There are personal security issues that are, I've got a wife and family. I'd rather not get bombed again. Yes, there are impediments, but if we can train enough people who are there as instructors, they can keep it going long after we're gone. And they understand the culture, they know, they get told by the community who's causing trouble where. We never get that. We're told when to stay inside, when to not go to the market, when to move the vehicle in the back and stay in the car for a while. We don't actually get pointed out to us who's right, because everybody else knows. So having the community begin to develop the capacity in itself, bringing language, in-language materials and leaving them is helpful. And that's one of the weaknesses we have with a lot of development work, is that we're not doing the training in the local language. We are expecting people to learn English. We're bringing people from the middle of the U.S. that don't have much in the way of language skills and may not have a passport in to be parts of the PRTs, the Provisional Reconstruction Teams in Afghanistan, and they have no way to reach across, and they don't have the social skills or the international skills to know that they should, and we get less bang for our very large bucks. So, kind of a long and wandering answer, but did that help? Yes, you do need to start with somewhere. We would have had a good dinner.
Really enjoyed it. There is a counter argument to this, that urbanization is sort of our demise and is our downfall. And it kind of comes out of urban ecologists or conservation biologists who talk about, and I do want to preface this by saying I don't want to diminish in any ways the difficulties in the slums.
Cities are far more efficient.
But they are tremendously efficient. And so you almost want to create circumstances where you have efficient transportation systems, where you have health facilities that reach the widest or the greatest population in the shortest amount of time. And those kinds of things happen where you get congregations of people, where you get urbanization. Yes, you also get slums, but we often talk in development the last mile problem. But if you have your problems so concentrated, and yet they are Hobbesian problems, but if you have your problems so concentrated, you also have an opportunity for the solutions to be concentrated. We haven't gotten there, but I think this sort of all urbanization is all bad all the time. I mean, in some ways, when people collect in the urban areas, it frees up, and it creates, more of these sort of, you get ecological repair, you get less stress on the areas out in the periphery and out in the rural areas. So there's a real healing effect in some ways when people move to the cities.
And it's increase of bombs in the city.
No, I understand that, but I'm saying that we're getting this real schism in terms of our thinking that all movement to the city represents, an exacerbation of problems, but it also means it's a targeted area for solutions. And so if you want to do big infrastructure solutions, you then aren't looking to get, these really dispersed the real difficulties you get in solving problems at a rural scale. So it just
I agree completely. I agree with everything that you say. The root cause analysis would show mass effect, would show there are simply too many people.
Yeah.
There are we didn't talk too much about it, but it's not just opportunity. There's also enough environmental degradation that migration is forced. Example, the northwest corner of China has the advent of the Gobi, and 23,000 villages have been abandoned because of increasing desertification. And I mean, my source is National Geographic. National Geographic did a special on the rural farms of northwest China, and the fact that people are watering plants in entire fields by hand, one little trickle at a time. A man hadn't had a bath or a shower or hadn't cleaned himself in a year because the water cannot be spared. And they're not kidding about this. This is something they would take lightly. They're actually a pretty clean, personal population, but it can't be spared. It has to go to the plants or they die. Not the plants, the people. 23,000 villages abandoned. Chinese government is very aware of this, right? And a lot of the problem, in fact, we haven't talked much about this, but a lot of the problems in the Jiang province in the west is driven by climate change. Alterations in the environment, maybe not climate change, probably made worse by climate change. And those don't usually come into the discussions. They become rebels, or they are Muslims and so don't fit with the Han, or so. But a lot of it is environmentally driven. That's true for the tribal wars that are taking place in Kenya. We had somebody from Kenya. There you are. I shouldn't miss you. You're only 18 inches away. The tribal wars in Kenya between a number of tribes is driven in great part by the changes in the grazing pattern because of the ENSO, the oscillation that is making these extremes. And the rains, the light rains and the heavy rains are not happening like they're supposed to. So these are climate issues, and yet they get blamed on, for example, small weapons proliferation, small arms proliferation. Well, that's only one bit. Yes, that's true. That certainly makes it worse. Well, what's the phrase from Eddie Izzard? People, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, guns help, right? So there are many factors that are going into this, but you're right. There's also an effort, you can look at a TED talk, sorry to hammer on TED, but I'm fond of TED. They're about the food footprint of London. Very good study about what it takes in growing area to supply the city of London with a day, just 3 meals in a day. And it's larger, the area is larger than the British Isles. It's phenomenal. Comes from around the world, but it's an amazing number. Population is a root issue. Yes, there's a lot to catch up with. A lot of environmental remediation needs to take place. And there are things that are already apparently past tipping points and will be consequences we have to deal with. But getting a handle on population would be a great start. And I'll stop. Oh, yes, ma'am?
Well, I have two questions, and they're sort of a little bit unrelated. The first is on what we're talking about is city and agriculture, basically people moving into urban areas.
Mm-hmm.
At what point do we not have enough people producing food anymore to feed everybody because everybody's moved to a city and is no longer producing food?
Yeah.
And then the second one is really more related to housing, but I'd like to, I guess.
Okay. So the question is, if we have people moving into the city and abandoning village agriculture, at what point do we reach the tipping point where we do not have enough food being raised? Good question, and I don't know the answer, but I know that many countries have become food importers that used to be food exporters. Some of that is the sheer population increase. Others may be that there is not as much land being cultivated as there was before. But to be honest, I don't know the answer, but I can imagine that it's a genuine issue. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to stop the public questions now, but thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Good brain food, a little depressing, but otherwise great. We'll have drinks now. Thanks for coming, and if you have any additional one-off questions you were too shy to ask, grab them quickly.